And that's all.
How about you?
Well, I think we mentioned the other time that my father couldn't get a job either. Things were very, very bad. And my mother used to do what they call housework. They would pick up, say, dresses from a contractor. And my mother would sew eyelets on the dress. Now, some dresses would have 100 eyelets or something like that, 50 eyelets. And my mother would be sewing around there, and she used to make a penny for an operation or a penny and a half if they were very involved. So she would work for hour after hour after hour, and she'd end up with about 5 or 10 cents earning, 15 cents earning. And it was a very, very, very difficult time. I think I mentioned that we used to shop in the Park Avenue market on 150th to 110th Street. And we used to buy scraps of vegetables that were decaying, and tomatoes and potatoes. We would buy them for a few pennies. My mother would cut away all the bad parts, and we would cook the other parts.
What was your reaction to the New Deal?
Oh, the New Deal was wonderful. I remember when Roosevelt came in, and one of the first things he did was close all the banks. All federal banks were closed. Because you know what was happening? People were getting in line to take out their money while they could still get it. Banks were failing every day. And it was not unusual to see hundreds of people standing in front of a bank trying to take out something, $1, $5, whatever they could get. They were trying to take it out. Now here comes a man like Roosevelt, and he closes all the banks. And then he introduced some bank recovery acts, which Congress passed immediately. And he reopened the banks with a guarantee that the federal government would guarantee your deposit up for a certain sum of money. You don't need to worry, you won't lose it. So
like
therefore the people...
FDIC today.
Yeah, FDIC is what we call it today. And the people felt at that time, if the government backed us up on the money, then they left their money in the bank and they were no longer runs. But it was interesting to note that all over the world, there were runs on the banks. And why? Because one of the most prominent banks in the United States was a bank called
Bank of the United States.
Bank of the United States. That was a private bank. But the Chinese didn't know that it was a private bank, and the Italians and the British, and they didn't know this. As soon as they heard the Bank of the United States was failing, everybody began to sell money and try to grab the money out of the United States. It was a mad, mad world. It was terrible, completely unstable, because they were all afraid that the Bank of the United States had failed. It was a tough time. At that time, we saw many times where bank presidents, or former bank presidents, would stand on Fifth Avenue selling shiny apples at a nickel apiece to earn something to bring home. Family, bring home a nickel, a dime, or whatever they can bring home. It was a very difficult time. People used to walk a great deal, and there was an industry developed. The industry developed where people would be walking around neighborhoods, buying up old clothing, old shoes, and you could hear the cry all day long: "Alte Sachen, alte Schier, alte Sachen, alte Schier." They were buying old things or old shoes. And they would pay you a nickel, 3 cents, a quarter, whatever you happen to have. And somehow or other there was a market for these things. They would somehow or other fix up the old clothing and somehow or other fix up the old shoes and sell it at a profit. Not a big profit, but they would sell it. So they were making money. There were newspapers, boys' newspapers were selling newspapers. In those days, you could buy a paper for 2 cents. Or 3 cents. And boys would sell it. And one trick that they used a great deal would be, late in the afternoon, men would be running through the streets saying, "Extra, extra, read all about blah, 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 blah." And you'd never know what he was saying, but he'd scream, "Extra, extra," and people would rush over to buy the paper. And when you bought the paper, you looked at it, there was nothing new. It was the same old stuff. But you thought he was selling you something very, very special.
Incidentally, apropos to what Dad was saying, and I thought of it, In New York City, do you know how many papers there were? How many?
I say about somewhere between 20 and 30 newspapers. I mean legitimate newspapers. We're not talking about
Not only
these
did they have the
little
New York
ball
Times, now they have the New York Times and the Post. But
And
then
USA
they had
Today, USA Today would be a third paper.
Daily News, they say.
Daily News would be a fourth paper.
But then they had about 20 papers.
Over there they had, I think, 3 or 4 Jewish papers every day. They had Italian papers. They had, I think, Greek papers or foreign language papers. There are a lot of newspapers in those days. My friend's father used to work for the Forwards, and his son, Esther's brother, used to work for the Hearst companies. He worked in the newspapers.
Tell us
So-
about the NRA.
The NRA, I think it was the National Recovery Act, I
Yes.
think they call it.
There was
Roosevelt-
a sense of euphoria
Roosevelt
when
introduced
Roosevelt came in.
a whole series of bills which Congress passed more or less promptly. And these bills set up standards where companies there was some kind of regulation of companies so that they were not a world by themselves. They couldn't do everything they wanted. And business began to improve considerably, and people began to get jobs. And there was a whole feeling in the country that we were on the right track, we were moving in the right direction.
The NRA, people used to put that symbol in their windows,
The
and
Blue
everybody
Eagle.
was all excited about the NRA, as though this is the beginning of great things to come.
They had confidence in the government, they had confidence in the laws, but the Republican Party opposed every one of those things, the guarantees of bank accounts, anything that he had that was social legislation. The Republican Party said no. Their whole answer was always no. So finally one day they decided that the NRA, which was regulating business too much, they couldn't stomach it, so they acted upon a chicken company.
Schechtman Poultry.
Schechtman Poultry? Yeah, they acted upon a chicken company. And they said that this is not interstate commerce and so forth. And they took it up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court eventually ruled that it was not interstate commerce. And they threw out a lot of NRA regulations. But by that time, the government was on its way, was improving. Now, at the same time, Hitler was acting in Germany. You see, the Germans went through a very difficult time in 1923. They had inflation of the worst kind, where they kept printing money as fast as the government could print the money. It couldn't print it fast enough. So they began to print it with larger denominations. And there was a time in Germany when the boss would pay his laborers twice a day. The wife would be waiting outside the factory. As soon as he got his pay at 12 o'clock, he ran out, he gave his wife the money, she ran out and bought something, anything. If he can buy it, she bought it. No matter what it was, she bought it. Because by 6 o'clock at night when he came out, that money was almost worthless. They were printing more money. We saw cartoons of people buying a loaf of bread, coming away from the baker with a wheelbarrow full of money. That was the change from a loaf of bread. It was terrible. The Chinese had a different system, I think, at that time, or a little later, where they were taxing people. They couldn't get enough taxes in 1 year, so they taxed them for a year and the next year. I think if I remember correctly, they were taxing the people after a period of time for about either 50 years ahead or maybe 100 years ahead, I forget which. But they were taxing him generations ahead, collecting money from future generations. All of these subterfuges didn't work.
About the Depression time, I recall, my mother went to work. I was a young kid, and so was my brother, but we were self-reliant. We went to school. My mother went to work in the garment factory in New York, downtown. And many other mothers started to work at that time. Up till then, they didn't work. That was the beginning when the wife would work. Now, many women go to work. But in those days they had to. My father was a house painter, and there were periods when he had work and periods when he didn't have work. Somehow, my mother managed. She managed. Anything else?
They had periods. My father was a tailor. They had slack periods. Certain times of the year, let's say during the summer, there's practically no business at all. So he would be without work, and there was no unemployment insurance. So he would get nothing.
There was no such thing.
He would get nothing from that. We had a wonderful organization in the community known as the Hebrew Free Loan Society, where they would lend money to people free of charge, without any interest charge. You get it free of charge, and you'd have to pay back within a period of, say, 6 months, sometimes a year. You'd pay back the money that you borrowed, but you'd pay no interest at all on the loan. And that helped a great many people. I think there may still be a Hebrew Free Loan Society today. I'm not sure of it, but in those days we had it, and it came in very handy. And the kids, what did we do for amusement, entertainment? We had very simple tastes. When we were younger, we used to play, I think we described the other day, ball, hopscotch, marbles, stuff like that. When we got older, we used to go to concerts, and on Sundays we used to go hiking. Oh, occasionally we would go on a boat ride up the Hudson River. And that was a lot of fun. You'd pack a lunch. And, your mother would give you all kinds of things. You'd pack a real lunch, enough for about 12 people. And you'd go up to Poughkeepsie or what was it?
Bear Mountain Park.
Bear Mountain Park would be a place. And when you get off at Bear Mountain Park, there were all kinds of activities there. It was a lot of fun, and it didn't cost very much. And it was so much fun on these big boats. High schools used to have an outing one day a year on the Bear Mountain boats. And they would go up the Hudson River. It was nice when you passed. There was a bridge over Poughkeepsie. You passed the Poughkeepsie Bridge. The Hudson was a beautiful river, really beautiful. In those days, they used to have a fish called shad, S-H-A-D. And people used to go fishing, and there was a large quantity of shad. You get lots of them. But subsequently, General Electric opened a plant near Schenectady, an electrical plant, and during the late 40s or 50s or so, they began working with chemicals which were quite poisonous. And you know how manufacturing companies behave. When you get some poison, you dump it into the river. There was no restriction, so they dumped it into the river. And after a while, they killed a lot of the fish. I don't think they've ever recovered. And General Electric has been paying money to dig up all the poisonous waste that they put into the Hudson. They're still digging it for years and years and years.